The crisp New England air, usually a balm, felt like a perpetual ache against Arthur Vance's skin. 1 week to the day since Eleanor's burial, her stepson, Julian, sat opposite him at the reclaimed oak table in their sun-drenched kitchen, a place where Eleanor had started every morning for 25 years. The scent of salt and pine, usually comforting, now seemed to mock the hollowness in the room. "I believe it's only right that I take over the shipyard, the marina, and all of Eleanor's financial holdings," Julian stated, his voice calm, almost detached. He gestured vaguely with a manicured hand. "Given her wishes for the legacy to stay within the family." Arthur wished he could claim surprise. But the truth was, he was too profoundly weary to feel anything so sharp. It was a Tuesday morning, late October. The maples on the drive leading down to Vance Boat Works had shed most of their fiery leaves, leaving the landscape looking stark, barren. Everything felt emptier. He sat nursing a cup of forgotten coffee, its warmth long since surrendered to the chill. Across from him, Eleanor's favorite antique captain's chair remained vacant, a silent testament to her absence. For a quarter-century, she had occupied that very spot, every morning, same routine. Coffee with a dash of cream, the local maritime news murmuring softly. A half-finished crossword puzzle beside her plate. Now, only silence filled the space where her gentle laughter once resonated. Grief, Arthur had learned, wasn't always the tidal wave of tears people imagined. Sometimes, it was just staring at an empty chair, the crushing realization that no one would ever sit there again. He was still lost in that desolate contemplation when the crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced a vehicle, a sleek black luxury sedan, utterly out of place amongst the weathered trucks and fishing skiffs. Not Julian's usual off-road beast. Seconds later, the front door opened. Arthur didn't stir. "Morning, Arthur." Julian's voice, smooth and practiced, cut through the quiet. He stepped into the kitchen, followed by a man in an impeccably tailored navy suit, a leather briefcase clutched in his hand. A lawyer, 7 days after Eleanor's funeral. The subtlety of a foghorn in a quiet harbor. Julian settled into a chair without invitation. The attorney introduced himself as Mr. Harrison and took the seat beside him. A heavy silence descended, thick with unspoken intentions. Julian finally clasped his hands, resting them on the table. "I've been giving considerable thought to Mom's legacy." The way he said it, the slight emphasis on Mom, grated on Arthur. He'd heard that exact phrasing 3 times already that week, each iteration feeling less about Eleanor and more about acquisition. Arthur merely nodded. "Okay." Julian briefly glanced at Mr. Harrison, then back at Arthur. "You know Eleanor always wanted the Vance name to remain synonymous with the shipyard. With our family's heritage." Arthur didn't reply immediately. Part of it was exhaustion. Part of it was that Julian's statement wasn't entirely outlandish. Eleanor had devoted years to helping him build Vance Boat Works into the respected institution it was today. He'd founded it, yes, a humble repair shed he'd inherited from his own father. But Eleanor, with her sharp mind for business and her unparalleled charm with clients, had transformed it. She'd managed the ledgers, nurtured relationships with the local fishermen and summer yacht owners, remembered every employee's anniversary and their children's names better than Arthur ever could. The company wasn't solely his, it was theirs. Julian leaned forward, his expression almost, but not quite, compassionate. "You've been through a tremendous amount, Arthur. I think it's only logical for me to step into a more significant leadership role moving forward." Mr. Harrison offered a small, approving nod. Arthur's gaze drifted to his cold coffee. He wasn't hearing a demand yet, but an argument. A self-serving one, perhaps, but still an argument. Then Julian continued, the facade of concern cracking slightly. "And I believe the family home should naturally remain on Mom's side of the family." There it was. Arthur slowly raised his eyes. "The house?" "Yes, and what precisely does that entail?" Julian hesitated, then delivered the core of his message. "I believe ownership should transfer to me." The room became utterly still. Mr. Harrison remained silent, his role merely to observe. Julian, emboldened, pressed on. "And the shipyard, of course. The entire enterprise." Arthur blinked. "The shipyard, Eleanor and I built that together." He let out a slow, deliberate breath. "What else? Her investment portfolios, the various trusts." Arthur almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly beyond belief. A week ago, they had stood together, mourning beside Eleanor's grave, surrounded by the quiet reverence of the community. Now they were haggling over her assets. He looked out the window toward the small, meticulously kept herb garden Eleanor had loved, then back at Julian, the boy he'd helped raise. And yes, despite Julian's 36 years, Arthur still often thought of him as a boy. Perhaps that was part of the problem. He remembered teaching Julian to tie a bowline knot, patiently guiding his hands as they repaired a damaged skiff, the pride in Julian's eyes when he finally mastered a difficult joinery technique. He remembered the night Julian called him from a remote coastal road, after wrapping his first pickup truck around a cedar tree. No injuries, just sheer panic. Arthur had driven 2 hours through a squall to get him, never a complaint. Then came college tuition, unexpected rent emergencies, the credit card debt after graduation. Every time Julian stumbled, someone was there to catch him. More often than not, it was Arthur. One memory surfaced with painful clarity. Julian, 19, home for Thanksgiving. Too much local brew, too much spirited debate about the future of the fishing industry, too much raw emotion. At one point, Julian had looked at him, his eyes glistening, and declared, "You've been more of a father to me than my own ever was." The next morning, Julian had pretended the conversation never happened. They never spoke of it again. Funny how grief had a way of dredging up old, half-buried memories. Arthur sat there, studying Julian, trying to comprehend how they had arrived at this precipice. Finally, he posed a simple question. "Did Eleanor tell you she wanted all of this transferred to you?" Julian shifted almost imperceptibly. A minute movement most wouldn't notice, but Arthur did. Not precisely. That answer, Arthur knew, was all he needed. Mr. Harrison quickly interjected. "We are simply trying to facilitate a fair and equitable resolution for all parties." Fair, an interesting word choice. At that moment, Arthur's phone vibrated in his pocket, a text message. Sylvie Dubois, his own attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had handled their estate planning for years. The message was succinct. "Call me before signing anything." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Julian continued to elaborate, Mr. Harrison interjecting with legalistic explanations. Words blurred together. Ownership, estate, transfer, assets, future. Arthur stopped listening, his mind drifting back to Eleanor. Their last conversation, mundane and everyday. She'd asked him to pick up some special teak oil from the chandlery. That was it. No profound wisdom, no dramatic farewell. No one tells you how much you'll miss the ordinary conversations. Eventually, Julian rose, signaling the meeting's end. Mr. Harrison gathered his papers. As they walked toward the door, Julian paused. Arthur looked up. "I think fighting this would only make things harder on everyone." There was a tone of concern in his voice, or perhaps a carefully crafted performance. Arthur honestly couldn't tell anymore. After they left, Arthur called Sylvie. She answered immediately. "How bad was it?" "Worse than expected." She sighed. Then she said something peculiar, something Arthur didn't quite grasp at the time. "Eleanor made sure everything was perfectly in place." Arthur frowned. "What does that mean?" "You'll understand later." It wasn't particularly comforting. For the next hour, Sylvie laid out their options. Why they could fight, why they should fight, and why they'd likely win. All the while, Arthur stared out the window at Eleanor's beloved herb garden, its autumn-browned foliage reflecting the faded light. Finally, Sylvie paused. "Arthur? Yeah. What do you want to do?" His answer surprised them both. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps utter exhaustion, or something deeper, an instinct he couldn't name. The words simply spilled out before he could stop them. Let him have it. Silence. Arthur, let him have everything. Even articulating it aloud felt absurd, a surrender to the overwhelming tide. Sylvie sounded aghast. "Are you serious?" He looked at the empty captain's chair one last time. Then he answered, "Completely." In that moment, anyone around him would have sworn he'd lost his mind. The strange thing was, Arthur wasn't entirely sure they were wrong. The first person to call him an idiot wasn't Sylvie, nor one of his long-time employees. It was his older brother, Robert. 3 days after Arthur instructed Sylvie not to contest Julian's claims, his phone rang at 7:30 a.m. He knew who it was before he even picked up. "Arthur, tell me this isn't true." Arthur rubbed his eyes. "I assume Sylvie called you." "She did so. It's true then." A long pause stretched between them. Then came the inevitable explosion. "You built Vance Boatworks from a single inherited shed and a battered skiff, working 70-hour weeks for 30 years. I know. And now you're just handing it away?" Arthur stared out the front window. The sky was gray again, a somber canvas mirroring his mood. "Everything seemed gray lately. I'm tired, Robert." "That's grief talking, little brother." Perhaps it was. But the problem was, Arthur couldn't differentiate anymore. Since Eleanor's death, every decision felt like he was making it underwater, shrouded in a heavy fog. People expected him to act rationally. Meanwhile, he couldn't walk past her old foul-weather gear hanging by the mudroom door without losing his train of thought, his breath catching in his throat. Robert wasn't the only one upset. The following weekend, 2 longtime employees showed up at his house. Marco Rossi, his lead shipwright, had worked alongside Arthur for 23 years. Marco's wife brought a generous clam chowder, because apparently, that's what people do in coastal Maine. When someone loses a spouse, they bring food, enough to feed a small fleet. Marco sat across from Arthur in the living room, his usually jovial face etched with worry. "Arthur, people are talking." "I figured. They think Julian's taking over." Arthur nodded. "He probably is." Marco looked genuinely sick. The shipyard employed 43 people, many with families, mortgages, children in college, retirement plans hanging in the balance. Julian scared them, not because he was malicious, but because he was impulsive, unpredictable, and frankly didn't understand the craft. Marco leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Please tell me you have a plan, Arthur." Arthur looked down at his calloused hands. The honest answer? He didn't know. Not yet, so he simply said, "I'm working through some things, Marco." It wasn't enough for Marco, but it was all Arthur had to offer. After Marco left, the house felt even emptier than before. That became the hardest part. Not the legal wrangling. Not Julian's demands, it was the house. Every room resonated with Eleanor's presence. The kitchen, the family room, the narrow hallway where she'd often stop him. A playful glint in her eyes, to remind him he'd forgotten something. Again. For weeks he couldn't bring himself to touch her belongings. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, he finally started. He carried a sturdy cardboard box into their bedroom and sat on the floor beside her closet. The scent enveloped him immediately. Her faint, familiar perfume, a whisper of lavender and sea salt, almost gone, but still there. He just sat for a minute, a 60-year-old man on the floor, staring at a row of her sweaters. Grief was strange that way. One moment you were grappling with monumental decisions. The next you were staring at a simple cardigan because it still carried the ghost of someone you loved. He opened the first drawer, silk scarves, a few pieces of jewelry, old receipts. Nothing significant. Then he found a small, leather-bound photo album. Inside were pictures from years ago. Julian at 12, covered in mud after a junior sailing regatta, Eleanor laughing so hard she could barely hold the camera steady, Arthur beside them with a truly ridiculous mustache he'd completely forgotten existed. That actually made him chuckle. The first genuine laugh he'd managed in weeks. A few pages later he found another photo. Julian at 16, holding a delicate silver compass charm. Arthur remembered that day clearly. Julian had spent 2 months saving money from his summer job at the local bait shop to buy it for Eleanor's birthday. Back then, he wasn't thinking about inheritance. Back then he just wanted his mother to smile. That picture bothered him. It reminded him that life wasn't simple. Julian wasn't a one-dimensional villain. He had been a good kid once. Maybe that's why everything hurt so much. He continued sorting, hours blurring by. Rain pattered softly against the windows. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passage of time with its steady tick-tock. Every item carried a memory, some bringing a fragile smile, others threatening to break him. Then he discovered something peculiar. A file folder tucked behind several old blueprints. Inside were company records, financial statements, partnership agreements, estate planning documents. Nothing unusual at first. But one set of papers caught his attention. Several years earlier, Julian had attempted to secure substantial personal loans, leveraging potential future business connections without proper authorization. Nothing criminal, nothing technically improper, but profoundly irresponsible. The loans never materialized. Eleanor had shut down the idea immediately, firmly but discreetly. Arthur sat back, processing this new information. That wasn't the Julian he remembered, or perhaps it was simply the Julian he hadn't wanted to see. That evening, he called Sylvie. She arrived carrying takeout from a small, unpretentious seafood shack Eleanor had loved near the old lighthouse. They sat at the kitchen table, eating steamed mussels and lobster rolls from plastic containers. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt normal. For the first time in a long while, normal mattered. Sylvie studied him for a moment. "You look utterly drained." "I am. Sleeping?" "Barely." She nodded. Then she asked an unexpected question. "What do you think Eleanor would tell you right now?" Arthur gave a soft, mirthless laugh. "Probably to stop skipping breakfast." Sylvie smiled. "Sounds about right." For a while, they talked about Eleanor. Not the estate, not the boatworks. Just Eleanor. The woman who remembered everyone's birthday. The woman who secretly paid employees' medical bills when they fell on hard times. The woman who never left a restaurant without complimenting the server. Eventually, Sylvie stood to leave. Before she reached the door, Arthur remembered something crucial. "Wait." He retrieved the file folder. Sylvie perused the documents, her expression subtly changing. Not dramatically, just enough. "What?" She looked up. "Keep searching." "For what?" "For everything." That answer irritated him. What does that even mean? "It means Eleanor was smarter than both of us." Then she left, leaving Arthur more confused than enlightened. A few days later, Arthur returned to the closet. This time, he searched with meticulous care, box by box, drawer by drawer. Near the back of a seldom-used shelf, he found a small, exquisitely carved wooden keepsake box. He almost overlooked it. Almost. Inside were old greeting cards, faded family photos, and a sealed envelope. His name was scrawled across the front in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. His stomach tightened. He knew instantly this wasn't something she had simply forgotten. This was intentional. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a letter, only a few pages long. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. The first paragraph brought tears to his eyes. The second made him laugh, a choked, wet sound. Classic Eleanor. Even from beyond the grave, she managed to evoke both emotions. Then he reached the section that changed everything. The words seemed to leap off the page, imbued with her spirit and foresight. "Arthur, if Julian ever mistakes kindness for weakness, stop rescuing him." He read it again. Slowly. Then another sentence. One that would forever be etched in his memory. "He keeps chasing ownership when he should be learning responsibility." Arthur stared at those words for a long time. The room felt utterly still, the rain outside a distant murmur. For years he had protected Julian from consequences. So had Eleanor, perhaps too often. Maybe that was their shared mistake. For the first time since her death, a profound thought entered his mind. Not anger, not revenge, something else, a possibility. Maybe giving Julian exactly what he wanted wasn't surrender at all. Maybe it was the very lesson Eleanor had been trying to teach him all along. And if that were true, then Sylvie's strange confidence suddenly made a lot more sense. For the next 3 months, Arthur Vance became, in the eyes of many, the most stubbornly uncooperative man in their quiet New England town. At least, that's how it felt. Everyone expected him to fight. Everyone wanted him to fight. And every time someone asked what he was doing, he gave the same maddeningly vague answer. Nothing yet. People detested that answer, especially when significant assets were involved. The first month after finding Eleanor's letter was the hardest. He still wasn't completely convinced he was making the right decision. Some mornings he would wake up with a surge of conviction that he and Sylvie had a solid plan. Other mornings he'd stare at the ceiling, wondering if grief had finally unmoored his judgment. Vance Boatworks didn't halt simply because his personal life had imploded. Orders still needed to be filled. Custom builds required attention. Clients called. Payroll still had to go out every Friday. Life relentlessly demanded attention, even when his heart wasn't in it. One Monday morning, Arthur drove to Vance Boatworks before sunrise. The main yard, nestled beside the cove just off Route 1, had been his professional home for nearly 30 years. The place looked exactly the same. Weathered cedar shingles, sturdy pilings reaching into the tidal waters, the rhythmic creak of boats tethered at their slips. But something felt different. People looked nervous. The rumors had spread like wildfire. Julian was coming. Everyone knew it. Nobody knew when. By lunchtime, Arthur had his answer. The sleek black BMW pulled into the gravel lot. Julian stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, a gleaming watch glinting on his wrist, a timepiece that probably cost more than Arthur's first fishing vessel. A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. Julian strode into the office as if he already owned the place. Perhaps in his mind he did. He shook hands, offered practiced smiles, engaged in superficial small talk. For about 20 minutes, he maintained a professional demeanor. Then, the real Julian began to emerge. Arthur overheard him talking with Marco, discussing the long-term vision. We need younger blood, a fresh perspective, modernizing our approach. That single sentence seemed to irritate half the building. Most of their skilled craftsmen were over 50, many having worked there, longer than Julian had been alive, their knowledge forged over decades of working with wood and water. A few days later, Julian scheduled a major staff meeting without consulting Arthur. Then another. Every week his confidence swelled, and every week the apprehension among the staff deepened. One afternoon, Marco Rossi knocked on Arthur's office door. Got a minute, Arthur? Arthur already knew where the conversation was heading. Sure, Marco. Come in. Marco closed the door, his usual robust voice lowered. You need to stop him, Arthur. Arthur leaned back in his chair. Stop him from what, Marco? Marco laughed, a short, frustrated bark. Come on, Arthur. He waited, then leaned in further. He doesn't understand this business. Not really. There it was. The truth everyone was afraid to voice. Julian understood appearances. He understood titles. He understood looking successful. What he didn't understand was the intricate, nuanced way the boatworks actually functioned. He never inquired about their specialized lumber suppliers, never asked about the precise inventory of rare bronze fittings, never questioned why certain clients, generations of them, had remained fiercely loyal for 20-30 years. Never asked why some employees were practically family, their skills honed over decades. His focus was always somewhere else. Control, ownership, status. Marco sat down, his shoulders slumped. You built this place, Arthur. You and Eleanor. You know what I mean, Arthur did. The conversation lingered long after Marco left, a heavy weight in the air. Marco wasn't wrong. That night, Arthur drove home feeling worse than usual. The house greeted him with its familiar, aching silence. He reheated leftover chowder, watched half a documentary about oceanic exploration, but absorbed none of it. Around 9 o'clock, his phone rang. Sylvie. How bad? She asked, cutting straight to the chase. You tell me. She chuckled softly. That bad, huh? Arthur recounted Julian's meetings, the growing employee anxiety, the palpable tension. When he finished, Sylvie was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, Do you trust Eleanor? The question caught him off guard. Of course. Then trust the decisions she made. Arthur knew what she meant. Over the next few weeks, Sylvie finally began to explain things more clearly. Not everything, but enough to offer a glimmer of understanding. 3 years earlier, after several incidents involving Julian's precarious finances, Eleanor had insisted they thoroughly review every aspect of their estate planning. Not because she wanted to punish him, but because she was genuinely worried about his future and the future of the boatworks. The comprehensive restructuring had taken nearly a year. Attorneys, accountants, financial advisors. Every document meticulously reviewed multiple times. Every signature properly recorded. Everything completely legal, completely ironclad. The more Sylvie explained, the more impressed Arthur became. Eleanor had thought years ahead, long before anyone could have imagined her sudden passing. One afternoon, Sylvie spread a multitude of documents across her conference room table, a map of Eleanor's strategic genius. She tapped a specific page. This is the key. Arthur studied it. Most of it looked like indecipherable legal jargon. Sylvie simplified it. The operating assets are protected. Protected how? So nobody can strip them for quick cash, Arthur. So Julian can't sell valuable waterfront land for condos. So he can't liquidate the specialized equipment, the historic boat designs, or the long-term supply contracts. Arthur stared at the paperwork, a growing astonishment blooming in his chest. So Julian can't sell everything? No. He can't borrow against it? No. He can't empty the company accounts? No. Sylvie smiled, a hint of admiration in her eyes. He can, however, own the responsibilities. That was the first time Arthur had laughed during a legal meeting. A week later, something happened that nearly changed everything. Julian showed up at Arthur's house unannounced. Arthur opened the door, bracing himself for another argument. Instead, Julian looked utterly exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped. For a second, he reminded Arthur of the teenager who used to sit at their kitchen counter, eating cereal straight from the box after a tough day on the water. "Can we talk?" They sat in the family room, the same room where Eleanor and Arthur had spent countless evenings, listening to the crackle of the fireplace, planning their future. Julian stared at the floor. "I miss her, Arthur." The words sounded genuine, painfully so. For nearly an hour they talked about Eleanor. Not money, not lawyers, just Eleanor. Her terrible singing voice when she was happy, her obsession with cultivating prize-winning hydrangeas, the way she cried during sentimental holiday commercials. Several times, Julian's eyes filled with tears. Arthur's did too. When Julian finally stood to leave, he looked at Arthur, a raw vulnerability in his gaze. "I never wanted things to get like this." For a moment, Arthur almost believed everything could still be mended. For a fleeting second, he considered calling Sylvie the next morning and halting the entire plan. Then Julian said something, one tiny sentence that shattered the fragile moment. "Once the transfer is complete, maybe I can finally start making real changes at the boatworks." There it was. The mask slipped. Just for a second. But long enough. The company. Again, ownership. Again, not people, not responsibility, not Eleanor. Arthur watched him walk back to his car, and suddenly, he understood with crystal clarity why Eleanor had written that letter. Love wasn't the problem. The absence of boundaries was. The final hearing was scheduled for the following month. As the date approached, the pressure intensified. Relatives called constantly, offering unsolicited advice. Employees whispered nervously. Friends questioned Arthur's sanity. Some nights he questioned it himself. The evening before the hearing, Arthur sat alone in the backyard, the cold October air biting at his exposed skin. Eleanor's beloved herb garden was nearly bare, dormant for the winter. He pulled her letter from his jacket pocket. He'd carried it for weeks, the paper already beginning to crease along the folds. He read the final paragraph again, slowly, carefully. When he finished, he looked toward the dark kitchen window, catching his own reflection. For the first time in months, he felt calm, not confident, definitely not comfortable, just calm. The next morning, he would walk into the courthouse. Either Eleanor's intricate plan would work, or he would lose what remained of the life they had built together. And honestly, he still wasn't sure which outcome terrified him more. Arthur didn't sleep the night before the hearing. Not even for an hour. He tried. Around midnight, he turned off the television and went upstairs. At 1 a.m., he stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the gloom. At 2 he walked into the kitchen and made coffee he didn't need. By 4:30, he gave up entirely. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the old county courthouse in the heart of town. Arthur left the house just after 7. The morning was cold, one of those gray New England mornings where everything looked slightly faded, muted. As he backed out of the driveway, he caught himself glancing toward Eleanor's garden. Habit. 25 years created a lot of habits. The drive downtown felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed determined to force him into agonizing thought. What if Sylvie was wrong? What if something had been overlooked? What if he had spent months letting Julian walk directly into a disaster that would ultimately destroy them all? By the time he parked near the courthouse, his stomach felt like it was full of jagged rocks. Sylvie was already waiting near the entrance. She carried a slim leather portfolio and looked as calm as a person ordering a morning coffee. Arthur envied her composure. "You look terrible," she observed, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "Good morning to you too," she smiled. "Ready?" "No." "Perfect." They walked inside. The courthouse smelled exactly the way courthouses always smelled. Old paper, floor polish, the comforting scent of wood that had been refinished countless times. The hearing room wasn't grand, but it was crowded. Far more crowded than Arthur had anticipated. Several relatives had shown up, a handful of employees, a few local business associates. Apparently, people enjoyed watching family drama when it didn't directly involve them. Julian was already there. The moment Arthur saw him, he knew something had changed. Julian's confidence had escalated to another level. Dark suit, expensive watch, a fresh haircut. He looked less like a grieving stepson, and more like a man preparing for a victory speech. When he spotted Arthur, he smiled. Not cruelly, not overtly arrogant. Just the smile of someone who believed the outcome was already a foregone conclusion. He walked over. "Morning, Arthur. You doing okay?" That question, coming from Julian, almost made Arthur laugh. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'm here." That's something. For a second, they stood there awkwardly. The unspoken tension, a palpable third presence. Then Mr. Harrison called Julian over. The hearing began shortly afterward. Everyone took their seats. Papers were organized. Names were confirmed. Procedural details were reviewed, the usual legal routine. Nothing dramatic. At least, not yet. Arthur remembered noticing the sunlight streaming through one of the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the golden beam. For some reason, that detail stayed with him, perhaps because everything else felt unreal. The attorney overseeing the transfer process, a meticulous woman named Ms. Davies, reviewed the documents one final time. Then she looked at Arthur. "Mr. Vance, are you prepared to sign?" Arthur's mouth suddenly felt dry. He glanced towards Sylvie. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. He picked up the pen. For a brief moment he thought about Eleanor. Not the funeral, not the hospital, not the final painful days. He thought about a random Saturday morning years earlier. She'd been planting miniature rose bushes in the garden, arguing playfully with him about whether the new fishing nets should be treated with pine tar or a synthetic sealant. A completely meaningless argument, one of 1,000 tiny disagreements that formed the tapestry of their life together. And somehow that memory, that ordinary, vibrant moment, gave him the strength he needed. He signed. The scratch of the pen on the legal paper sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the hushed room. Several people shifted in their seats. A few relatives exchanged knowing glances. A silent consensus that Arthur had just surrendered. Julian looked pleased, very pleased. The documents were passed to him. Without hesitation, Julian signed as well, his hand movements confident and swift. Then, everything moved to the final review stage. The last set of attachments, the last confirmations, the last pages. And that's when things started changing. Julian's attorney, Mr. Harrison, was reviewing the documents, his usual calm demeanor unwavering. At first nothing seemed unusual. He turned a page, then another. Suddenly, he stopped, not dramatically, but with an abrupt stillness that was more unsettling than any sudden movement. His eyes moved back to the previous page, then forward again, then back again. Arthur saw the exact moment confusion flickered across Mr. Harrison's face, a subtle tightening around his eyes. Julian, ever attuned to signals, noticed it too. "Something wrong, Harrison?" Julian asked, his voice still confident, though a hint of impatience was beginning to creep in. No answer. Mr. Harrison kept reading, his brow furrowed deeper. The room felt different now. Quieter, the air suddenly thick with unspoken tension. Sylvie didn't move. Arthur didn't move. Nobody moved. Julian leaned forward, his earlier smile fading. "What's wrong, Harrison?" Still no answer. Mr. Harrison reached the very final attachment, the last page of the dense legal packet. A few seconds passed, then several more. The color slowly drained from his face. Not completely, but enough that everyone in the crowded room noticed. Enough to make Julian's smile disappear entirely. "What is it?" Julian demanded, his voice sharper now, a thread of genuine concern replacing his earlier swagger. Finally, Mr. Harrison looked up, his gaze locking onto Julian. His voice sounded very different now, careful, measured, concerned. Julian? A long, pregnant pause stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. You don't own what you think you own. The room went silent. Absolute silence. Julian blinked, his smooth composure cracking. What are you talking about? Mr. Harrison flipped through the paperwork again, his hands now trembling slightly. The title transfers. Yes, that's correct. The responsibilities transfer. Also correct. But the operating assets of Vance Boatworks were protected years ago. Separated. Ring-fenced. Julian frowned, his confusion deepening. What does that mean? Mr. Harrison exhaled slowly, a long, weary sigh. It was the kind of sigh people make when they realize they are about to deliver very, very bad news. It means, Julian, that you cannot liquidate the company. What? Julian's voice was a shocked whisper. You can't sell the protected assets, the waterfront property, the docks, the historic designs, the equipment. They are all secured as a perpetual trust for the continued operation of Vance Boatworks under a specific stewardship clause. That's ridiculous! This is my mother's estate! Julian sputtered, his voice rising. You can't borrow against them either, Mr. Harrison continued, ignoring Julian's outburst. Julian looked wildly at Sylvie, then at Arthur, then back at his attorney, his eyes pleading for an explanation. What are you saying, Harrison? What exactly are you saying? Mr. Harrison swallowed hard. I'm saying the structure was established years before Eleanor's death. It's an unbreakable legal trust, designed to ensure the Boatworks remains a functioning entity, a community asset, regardless of ownership changes. The room remained completely still. Employees who had been terrified for months were now staring openly, a mixture of shock and dawning relief on their faces. Julian grabbed the documents, his eyes moving frantically across the dense pages, scanning for a loophole, a mistake. No. His voice cracked raw with disbelief. No, that's not right. It can't be. It is, Mr. Harrison stated, his voice firm, pointing to several meticulously drafted sections. Every signature, every filing, every date, every legal safeguard. Everything is there. Everything was reviewed by multiple firms. Everything is legal. Everything is airtight. Then came the final blow. Sylvie stood. She removed a sealed document from her portfolio. Arthur recognized it immediately. Eleanor's other letter. Not the one for him, but the one she had entrusted to Sylvie, with explicit instructions to release it only. After the transfer was legally complete, Sylvie looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, holding their attention. Then she began to read. The first sentence mentioned Julian by name. His entire body stiffened, a visible shudder passing through him. The room listened, utterly captivated. Eleanor had written that she loved her son, always would. Nothing could ever change that. Then she wrote something else, something nobody, least of all Julian, expected. She said that love without accountability had in fact hurt him for years. She admitted she had spent too much time protecting him from consequences, shielding him from the very lessons he needed to learn. And she refused, she wrote, to let that continue after she was gone. The room was so quiet, Arthur could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum in his chest and the faint whir of the ventilation system overhead. Sylvie continued reading. Eleanor explained that true inheritance wasn't property. It wasn't money. It wasn't ownership in the superficial sense. It was responsibility. It was character. It was stewardship. It was the legacy of commitment to a community, to a craft. Then came the final line, the one that hit harder than anything else, a resonant echo of the letter Arthur had found himself. If Julian ever demands what isn't his, give him exactly what he asked for. The lesson will be worth more than the money nobody spoke. Not immediately. Julian stared at the table, his hands trembling visibly, clutching the now meaningless documents. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, he looked utterly small, not angry, not arrogant, just stunned. And for the first time in his adult life, no one, absolutely no one, stepped in to rescue him. The strange thing about winning is that sometimes it doesn't feel the way you imagined. For months, people had been anticipating Julian's downfall. They had wanted a dramatic explosion, a shouting match, a public meltdown, something they could recount in hushed tones over cups of coffee for years to come. That's not what happened. The hearing ended quietly, painfully quietly. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. People simply filed out of the room, one by one. A somber procession. The employees looked relieved, a collective exhale of tension. The relatives looked confused, their expectations of a dramatic family feud unfulfilled. Julian looked like someone had taken all the air out of him, leaving him deflated and hollow. Arthur stayed seated for a few moments after everyone else had risen. His body felt utterly exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, like he'd been carrying a massive anchor on his back for 6 months, and someone had finally, mercifully, set it down. Sylvie sat beside him, silent, understanding. Neither of them spoke for a long minute. Eventually she leaned over, her voice soft. "You okay?" Arthur thought about it, then shrugged, a gesture of profound weariness. "I don't know." That was the honest answer. Because despite everything that had happened, Julian was still the kid he'd helped raise. The boy Eleanor had loved with all her heart. Eleanor was still gone, and none of the legal victories in the world could change that crushing reality. Sylvie nodded, as if she understood exactly what he meant, her gaze kind. A few minutes later they walked outside. The cold November air hit Arthur's face immediately, a sharp bracing slap. For the first time all day he took a deep, full breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. Across the parking lot he saw Julian standing beside Mr. Harrison. They were arguing not loudly but intensely, their gestures sharp and agitated. Mr. Harrison looked frustrated, his shoulders hunched. Julian looked utterly lost, his face pale, bewildered. At one point he glanced toward Arthur, his eyes meeting Arthur's across the expanse of pavement. For a second, Arthur thought he might walk over. Maybe apologize. Maybe yell. Maybe ask questions, real questions, for the first time. Instead, Julian turned abruptly, climbed into his luxury sedan, and drove away, tires spitting gravel. That was the last time Arthur saw him for several months. Life didn't magically improve after that. In fact, things got messier before they got better. Julian, bruised but still determined, challenged several parts of the agreement, filing motion after motion. Nothing outrageous, just enough legal maneuvering to create headaches, to prolong the agony. Each one failed. The documents held up exactly as Sylvie said they would. The planning Eleanor had done years earlier was absolutely airtight. Every filing, every signature, every date. By spring, the legal challenges had finally ceased. The boatworks, however, still had problems. Months of uncertainty, of whispers and rumors had taken their toll. Several key clients had delayed contract renewals. A few skilled employees had considered leaving, unsure of the future. They had work to do. Real work. The kind that doesn't fit neatly into courtroom stories or dramatic revelations. Arthur spent most of the winter rebuilding confidence, meeting with clients, talking with staff, answering their anxious questions, listening more than speaking. He walked the docks, visited the workshops, his presence a steadying force. One afternoon in early March, Marco Rossi walked into Arthur's office carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He set one on Arthur's desk. "You look better, Arthur." "I feel older," Arthur countered. A wry smile touching his lips, Marco laughed. "That's not what I meant." Arthur knew. The truth was, Marco was right. Something had changed within him. Not because of the legal outcome, not because he had won, but because of Eleanor's letter. For years, Arthur had confused helping people with protecting them from consequences. They weren't the same thing. Not even close. Eleanor had understood that profound distinction long before he did. Around March, they held an all-hands employee meeting. Nothing fancy. Just folding chairs set up in the main boat shed, the air still smelling faintly of sawdust and varnish, coffee and donuts, the usual fare. Arthur stood in front of 43 people, his voice clear and steady, and told them the truth. The boatworks was stable. Their jobs were secure. The employee protection clauses Eleanor had fought so hard for would remain intact, a foundational pillar of their operation. A few people got emotional, tears welling in their eyes. Honestly, so did Arthur. One woman, Denise, who ran the administrative office and had worked there for 18 years, pulled him aside after the meeting. "I wish Eleanor could see this, Arthur." That one simple sentence hit harder than anything he'd heard in court. Because she was right. "I wish that too, Denise. I truly wish that too." Summer arrived, painting the coastal town in vibrant hues. The business improved. Orders increased, new custom builds came in. Clients returned, their faith in Vance Boatworks renewed. Life slowly found a rhythm again, a different one. You don't replace someone after 25 years. You learn how to carry their absence, how to integrate the profound void into the fabric of your life. That's the best way Arthur could describe it. Then, almost a year after the hearing, something truly unexpected happened. Julian called. Arthur stared at the phone for several seconds, watching the caller ID before finally answering. Hello? Silence. Then, a quiet, hesitant voice. Hey, Arthur. His voice sounded different, quieter, older, somehow. They talked for maybe 10 minutes, nothing dramatic, no grand apology, no emotional breakthrough. Just a conversation. He asked about the boatworks, the current projects. Arthur asked about Julian's new venture, a fledgling online consulting firm. Neither of them mentioned the hearing directly. Before hanging up, Julian said something that stayed with Arthur, a single, significant statement. I read Mom's letter again, Arthur. Arthur waited, holding his breath. A long pause followed, filled only by the crackle of the phone line. Then Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. I think I understand more of it now. That was it. No explanation, no details. Just that. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it was more progress than Arthur had ever expected. The following Sunday, Arthur drove out to the old seaside cemetery overlooking the Atlantic. He brought fresh flowers from a local nursery, the kind Eleanor always liked. Bright yellow daisies, their cheerful petals a stark contrast to the gray headstones. Nothing expensive, nothing elaborate, just simple flowers, the way she preferred. The morning was cool, a light breeze rustling through the ancient pines. He stood beside her headstone for a long time, longer than he had planned, letting the memories wash over him like the gentle tide. Eventually, he pulled her letter from his jacket pocket. The paper was worn now, soft around the edges, creased from countless readings. He read it one more time, slowly, letting Eleanor's unwavering wisdom settle deep within him. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. For several minutes, he simply stood there, thinking, remembering, missing her with an ache that was now interwoven with a quiet gratitude. Finally, a small smile touched his lips, the kind that comes when sadness and gratitude somehow exist together, in delicate balance. You were right, Eleanor, he whispered, his voice carried away by the sea breeze. Not just about the money, not just about the boatworks, about boundaries, about respect, about what happens when we keep saving people from the lessons they desperately need to learn for themselves. The wind moved through the cemetery, sighing through the trees. The yellow daisies rustled softly, a gentle counterpoint to the waves crashing on the distant shore. And for the first time since losing her, Arthur Vance felt something close to peace. Julian thought inheritance meant getting control. Eleanor understood it meant accepting responsibility. That, Arthur realized, was the profound difference between taking something and being truly worthy of it.